She thought he stole her father's ranch, but a hidden letter revealed the heartbreaking truth. He had worked 15 years just to keep a promise and save her.
Subscribe to Wild Sky Stories' new emotional tales every day.
The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains of Montana as Evangeline Hollister stood on the weathered porch of her childhood home. Her fingers gripped the wooden railing so tightly that her knuckles turned white, and her heart felt like it might shatter into 1,000 pieces as she watched the stranger ride up the dirt path toward the house. She had loved her entire life. 6 weeks ago, her father Thomas had passed away quietly in his sleep, leaving behind nothing but memories, a modest ranch, and a mountain of debt that Evangeline had known nothing about until the lawyers came calling. She had been teaching school in the nearby town of Cedar Falls, believing her father was content and comfortable on the family land. She had been wrong about everything. The man approaching on the black horse was named Silas Morgan, and according to the documents she had received 3 days ago, he now owned every acre of Hollister land. He had purchased it at auction for a price that barely covered her father's debts, and today he was coming to take possession of his new property. Evangeline wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, refusing to let this stranger see her cry. She was 24 years old, alone in the world, and about to lose the only home she had ever known. But she would face this moment with the dignity her father had always taught her to carry. Silas Morgan dismounted his horse near the fence and removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and eyes the color of storm clouds gathering over distant mountains. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 years old, with strong features and hands that showed the calluses of honest work. He approached the porch slowly, his boots making soft sounds in the dirt, and when he reached the bottom step, he stopped and looked up at her with an expression she could not quite read. Evangeline spoke first, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. She told him that she needed 1 more week to pack her belongings and find somewhere else to live. She explained that she was a school teacher and that she could pay him a small amount for the extra time if he required it. Silas shook his head and told her there was no rush. He said she could take all the time she needed, and his voice was gentle in a way that surprised her and made her angry at the same time. She did not want kindness from the man who was taking her home. She asked him why he had bought this particular ranch when there were dozens of others for sale across the territory. She demanded to know what made Hollister land so special to him, and her words came out sharper than she intended. Silas looked away toward the distant hills, and something passed across his face that looked almost like pain. He told her that he had his reasons, and that perhaps someday she would understand. Then he said something that confused her deeply. He told her that her father had been a good man, one of the best he had ever known. Evangeline felt her breath catch in her throat. She asked him how he could possibly know anything about her father because Thomas Hollister had spent the last 10 years rarely leaving this ranch. He had been a quiet man who kept to himself and treasured his solitude after her mother passed away. Silas put his hat back on and told her they would talk more later. He said he needed to check the condition of the barn and the fences, and he walked away before she could ask any more questions. For the next several days, Evangeline packed her belongings into wooden crates while watching Silas work from a distance. He rose before dawn and labored until sunset, repairing fences that had fallen into disrepair, cleaning out the barn that her father had neglected in his final months, and caring for the small herd of cattle that remained on the property. What struck her most was that he worked with a desperation that seemed to have nothing to do with profit. He treated the land and the animals with a tenderness that made no sense for a man who had simply purchased an investment. She caught him once standing at her father's grave behind the house, his hat in his hands and his head bowed, and she wondered what secrets this stranger carried in his heart. On the 5th day, a letter arrived addressed to Evangeline that changed everything. The envelope was yellowed with age, and the handwriting on the front belonged to her father. Inside, she found several pages covered in Thomas Hollister's careful script, dated 3 months before his death. Her hands trembled as she began to read, and with each word, the world she thought she understood fell away like leaves in an autumn wind. Her father wrote that if she was reading this letter, then he was gone, and Silas Morgan had kept his promise. He explained that he had been sick for nearly 2 years, a wasting illness that the doctors in Cedar Falls could not cure, and he had kept this secret from her, because he could not bear to watch her worry and grieve before it was necessary. He wrote that he had made terrible decisions after her mother died, taking loans from men who charged impossible interest, and gambling on cattle investments that never paid off. By the time he realized how deep the trouble had become, he owed more money than the ranch was worth, and there were men coming who would take everything and leave her with nothing. Then he wrote about Silas Morgan. 15 years ago, when Silas was just a boy of 15, he had arrived at the Hollister Ranch half-starved and running from a cruel uncle who had beaten him nearly to death. Thomas had found him collapsed in the barn, barely breathing, and had nursed him back to health over the course of 2 months. Her father wrote that he had offered Silas a home and a family, but the boy had too much pride and too much pain to accept charity. Instead, Silas had made a promise. He swore that someday he would repay Thomas Hollister for saving his life, no matter how long it took or what it cost him. Silas had left that summer and headed west to California, where he worked in the gold mines and then the railroads, saving every penny he earned for 15 years. He never forgot his promise, and he never forgot the man who had shown him that kindness still existed in a cruel world. When Thomas learned he was dying, he had written to Silas and told him everything. He explained about the debts and the men who had come to take the ranch, and he begged Silas not to let his daughter lose her home. Silas had written back immediately, telling Thomas that he had saved enough money over the years and that he would buy the ranch at auction, paying off all the debts and keeping Evangeline safe from the men her father owed. He promised that the ranch would always belong to her, even if his name was on the papers. Her father's letter ended with words that made Evangeline weep so hard she could barely breathe. He wrote that he had never told her about Silas, because he was ashamed of what he had done with the money, and because he wanted her to judge Silas for himself without the weight of obligation. He wrote that Silas Morgan was the son he had never had, and he prayed that someday Silas might become the family she needed. Evangeline sat on the floor of her bedroom for nearly an hour, the letter pressed against her chest, tears streaming down her face as she understood at last why a stranger had bought her home and treated her with such gentle patience. She found Silas in the barn as the sun was setting, brushing down his horse with steady strokes. When she entered, he turned and saw the letter in her hand, and his expression shifted into something vulnerable and almost afraid. She walked toward him slowly, and when she was close enough to touch him, she asked him why he had never told her the truth. She asked why he had let her believe he was just another man taking advantage of her misfortune. Silas set down the brush and faced her fully. He said that her father had asked him to wait, to let her find the letter in her own time. He said that Thomas had wanted her to know the truth without feeling obligated or pressured, and he had honored that wish even when she looked at him with suspicion and anger. Evangeline asked him about the promise he had made 15 years ago, and her voice was barely a whisper. She asked if he had really spent all those years working and saving just to repay a debt from his childhood. Silas nodded slowly. He told her that her father had given him more than food and shelter. All those years ago, Thomas Hollister had given him hope when he had none, faith in humanity when he had been ready to give up on the world entirely. He said that some debts could never truly be repaid, but a man had to try. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. He handed it to her and told her that he had planned to give this to her on the day she was ready to leave. Evangeline unfolded the paper and felt her heart stop beating for one long moment. It was the deed to the ranch, and it had her name written on it as the sole owner. Silas had already signed his name at the bottom, transferring everything back to her. She looked up at him with fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. She asked him where he would go, what he would do, because he had just given away everything he had worked 15 years to earn. Silas smiled for the first time since she had met him, and it transformed his face into something beautiful and warm. He told her that he had never wanted to own a ranch. He said that all he had ever wanted was to keep his promise and know that he had repaid the man who had saved his life. Evangeline shook her head and told him that she could not accept this gift. She said it was too much, that no one had ever sacrificed so much for her, and she did not deserve such generosity from a man she had judged so harshly. Silas reached out and gently took her hand. He told her that she was wrong about one thing. He said that when he had nursed his wounds in this very barn all those years ago, a little girl with brown braids and curious eyes had brought him soup every day and read him stories from her favorite books. He said that little girl had told him that he was brave and strong, and that someday everything would be better. Evangeline felt a memory stir, distant and dreamlike. She remembered a summer when she was 9 years old, and her father had told her to bring food to the barn for a sick calf that needed extra care. She remembered sitting on hay bales and reading aloud from her storybooks. But in her child's mind, the memory had faded into something she could not quite grasp. Silas told her that those stories and that kindness had sustained him through 15 years of back-breaking work. He said that on his worst days, when the mind seemed ready to collapse and the railroad crews worked through freezing storms, he would remember a little girl's voice telling him that heroes always found their way home. Evangeline could not speak. She simply stood there, tears flowing freely, as the stranger she had misjudged revealed himself to be the answer to a prayer she had not even known she was praying. She asked him to stay. The words came out before she could stop them, and she felt her face flush with embarrassment at her boldness. But she told him that this ranch was too much for one person, and that if he truly considered her father a part of his family, then perhaps he might consider making this place his home as well. Silas was quiet for a long moment, and his gray eyes searched her face, as if looking for permission to hope. He asked if she was certain, because he would never want to impose on her or make her feel uncomfortable in her own home. Evangeline laughed through her tears, the first real laugh she had experienced since her father's death. She told him that he had just given her everything she had lost, and asked nothing in return. She said that the least she could do was offer him a place to sleep and a warm meal. Something shifted in the air between them, something tender and new and full of possibility. Silas squeezed her hand and told her that he would be honored to stay, at least for a while, until she was settled and the ranch was running smoothly again. The months that followed were filled with hard work and healing. Silas taught Evangeline everything her fa there had never had the chance to teach her about running cattle and managing land. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk, and in the evenings, they sat on the porch and shared stories about the man they had both loved. Evangeline learned that her father had written letters to Silas for years, telling him about her accomplishments and her dreams and her growing into a woman of strength and compassion. She learned that Silas had carried those letters with him across every mile of his journey, reading them when he felt lost and alone. And slowly, as the seasons changed and the land came back to life under their care, something else began to grow between them. It started as friendship and respect, deepened into trust and understanding, and finally blossomed into a love that neither of them had expected to find. On a spring evening exactly 1 year after Silas had ridden up the dusty path to claim his purchase, he stood on the porch with Evangeline and told her that he had one more confession to make. He told her that he had fallen in love with her the moment she had stood on this very porch with fire in her eyes and demanded to know why he had bought her home. He said that her strength and her loyalty and her fierce devotion to her father's memory had captured his heart completely. Evangeline smiled and told him that she had fallen in love with him the moment she had read her father's letter and understood that such faithfulness and honor still existed in the world. Silas asked her if she would consider spending the rest of her life on this ranch with him, not as two people bound by debt and obligation, but as partners who chose each other freely and completely. Evangeline answered him without words, stepping into his arms and laying her head against his chest, as the sunset painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and rose. She had misjudged the cowboy who bought her father's ranch, and discovering his real reason had given her something she thought she had lost forever. It had given her family, and it had given her home. And most precious of all, it had given her love that would last for all the years to come.